I'm Sue Davey, I'm Chief Executive at Meningitis Now. We were formed over 30 years ago when there was an outbreak of meningitis in the Stroud and Stonehouse area of Gloucestershire. And families came together because they realised there was no information for people and nowhere for people to turn. So it's amazing that charities like ours, that's how they come to be, because of the inspiration of people. So we were formed in 1986 and we celebrate our 30th anniversary this year. And so much has been achieved, constantly inspired by the people who've had personal experience of meningitis and want to fight back.
Meningitis is a serious disease. There are lots of different types of meningitis. Some can make people very unwell, while others can be potentially fatal. Anybody can get meningitis, so babies and under 5s are the most at risk. Then the next risk group are students, but really anybody at any time can get meningitis. So everybody needs to be aware of signs and symptoms to look out for. It really is key that everyone gets treatment quickly. So bacterial meningitis is potentially fatal. It's why we need to tell people about the signs and symptoms to look out for. And recognising the signs and symptoms and getting medical help quickly can really be the difference between life and death.
There's no pain that I've ever felt like it. This pounding headache and my eyes felt like they were going to explode. Feeling my energy just being sapped away. And things started happening really, really quickly. My arms and legs felt like they were being smashed to pieces whenever they moved me. Suddenly, I remember the massive shock. The septicemia started kicking in and I completely let go. From the moment the GP arrived to getting into the hospital was the fastest hour of my life.
It's things like in young babies, a high temperature, they might go off their food, vomiting, generally drowsy and being cranky, in a bad mood, more crying. Then they can have rapid breathing and grunting. And then things like a stiff neck, which is more difficult to notice in children, but it can mean their head's pulled back because of inflammation of the meninges around the brain. Then things like most people associate a rash with meningitis. The rash is actually septicemia, and one type of bacteria that causes meningitis can commonly cause septicemia as well, which is blood poisoning. And it's actually the blood poisoning that produces the rash that people associate with meningitis. So you can test for this rash by rolling a clear drinking glass over the rash, and it doesn't disappear under pressure, whereas other rashes associated with other illnesses will do. If someone has a high temperature and a rash that doesn't fade, then it really is a medical emergency. But you never ever wait for a rash. You know, some people won't get it at all, and for others it might be a late sign. It's really important to know all the common signs and symptoms to look out for. In the early stages, things like a high temperature, headache, drowsiness, and generally feeling unwell could be almost anything, and that might happen over a couple of days. But the more serious symptoms that you associate with meningitis and septicemia, like the dislike of bright lights, neck stiffness, painful joints, and things like the rash that doesn't fade under pressure, if you notice any of those signs, then the deterioration is obviously rapid. So it's all about getting medical help as quickly as possible.
Basically, my son Daniel had meningitis in 1984. It was a couple of weeks before Christmas. And in those days, there's not much known about it. There have been a few cases in the valleys, but not much publicity. Classic really symptoms, he very quickly became ill. I'd gone Christmas shopping, left him with his nan, and when I came back he was really poorly, and it seemed, even as a first time mum, that was very unusual. There was no run up to being ill or anything. Took him home, started to be sick, called the doctor out straight away. But unfortunately, as I say, not much was known about it then, so the doctor said it probably was a virus, don't worry too much about it. It was the weekend, so but after 48 hours he was just considerably worse. On the Monday morning again called a doctor who came out and was not sure, but basically did more checks and said, if you're worried about him, call me later. And then that night he deteriorated quite rapidly, and he came out, said he was admitted as suspected meningitis, which was a real shock to us, obviously, because he'd not mentioned the word to us before. And we went straight to Gloucester Royal, and he had Haemophilus B, which is a serious bacterial form in the under 5s. He was obviously very, very poorly because it had been 2 days. Luckily for us, he didn't have septicemia, because I don't really think he'd have made it through. So he was in intensive care for 2 or 3 days. And then when he came out, we didn't really know what to expect. He was in a normal children's ward. Christmas was coming. We asked to take him home because there's nothing much more they could do. But he couldn't walk. He was 2.5. And obviously before all this had happened, was functioning as a normal 2.5-year-old. He couldn't even sit on a chair. He'd fall off. His balance was severely affected. And he clearly was still very unwell. So we kept going back for checks and nobody really knew. They thought maybe he was deaf, because there were times when he would shut right down and didn't respond to you talking to him, even though he's looking at you. So it was all a bit of a mystery, to be fair, for the first couple of years. He was very poorly, very weak, couldn't go to play school, was very tired all the time. When he eventually started school, they advised half days. And within about a year of school was quite clearly that he wasn't really making the progress that he should have been mentally. So we asked for an assessment to be done, and that took several years because of course then there were no known after effects and they didn't associate learning difficulties with meningitis. So I had a real battle with school, and then eventually when he was about 6.5 they did a private assessment. And there was minimal brain injury on the left-hand side, which meant that he couldn't sequence properly, his memory was impaired, and so there were neurological, damage on that side. He continued to be really, really tired. The hearing test, it always came back negative to say that he wasn't deaf, but at times he was very detached, so it was petit mal. He just shut down. It was very, very hard for us because there were no answers. There was no charity. I don't think people realise that you don't just get better from meningitis or die from it. There's a massive gap in the middle, and we've got no answers. We're totally in the dark, and it is, live in hell to see your child, who was a perfectly normal little boy, to suddenly be faced with all these problems. So the newspaper picked up on it and came out and did an interview, just the local Stroud News and Journal. And very, very quickly other people started ringing in saying, actually, this has happened to us. So we realised, crikey, it's not an isolated case, but equally nobody got help. From a local level, it obviously went fairly quickly into a national level because the local newspapers then became sort of regional, and then the big papers picked it up, the Daily Mirrors, the Daily Mail, and we got interviewed, and we were actually on BBC News at 10. So there was a huge interest, obviously, because this was something that nobody else had really touched on, and there are clearly a lot of families out there that needed the help. So we ran it from home for probably the first year, and then in 1986 decided it needed to be moved out of the home because obviously it was quite difficult with 2 young children. I had a 6-month-old daughter at the time when Dan became ill. Luckily, Howard Bailey gave us the little house down here, and we set that up. Great Meals were at the top of the road, and they gave us £60,000 over 5 years for our admin costs, which was a massive boost because at that stage we didn't have any paid staff. And also we had the building free of charge, and continued to let us for over 10 years free of charge. had that building. So we got some community service workers in, and they decorated it for £12.50, I think the total cost was. And that was amazing because the charity belonged to the people of Stroud. You know, everyone felt involved. The fundraising, everybody was fundraising for us. Everybody wanted to help. There was a 98% turnout for the study in Stonehouse because everyone was sort of like saying, yeah, okay, let's do something. And I think people are very proud of the charity because they've all been involved over the years. And it's why we stayed in Stroud, because this is where our heart is, even though obviously we're quite big now.
So my name's Rhiannon and I'm the research coordinator at Meningitis Now. My job is to look after the research programme, which involves working with our research teams around the UK to work towards our ultimate goal of preventing meningitis. I joined about 18 months ago now, and I was really inspired to work with a charity that was making great strides towards preventing and wiping out a really devastating disease. Meningitis Now has invested over £12 million into preventing meningitis over the last 30 years. Most of our research is based on vaccine development and working out how to stop the disease invading the body. But one of our most impactful pieces of research was a piece of research called Mosaic. Mosaic looked at after effects following meningococcal disease, specifically Men-B, and found that 30% of people who experience meningococcal disease would go on to experience subtle after effects. So after effects that are not immediately obvious, like limb loss or hearing effects, but are more subtle in terms of acquired brain injuries. This might manifest as difficulties in concentration, difficulties planning. So these are the kind of after effects that you might not notice in an infant, but when that child gets to school, they might suddenly have a lot more problems. This research was really impactful because it demonstrated that Men-B was causing lifelong problems in a way not previously properly understood, and meant that when it came to working out whether it was cost effective to bring in a new vaccine, there was far more evidence of need than previously thought. There's been amazing progress in treating and preventing meningitis, and we now have 5 really effective vaccines to prevent bacterial meningitis. Unfortunately, meningitis isn't beaten, and there's an awful lot more work for us to do. There's many types of meningitis which aren't preventable. One area that we want to do significant work in is in viral meningitis. People who experience viral meningitis are often told that they're experiencing a mild disease and one that they'll probably recover from in a couple of weeks. We know through our support work that this isn't always true, and that there are a minority of people who go on to experience after effects for quite some time. Unfortunately, medical research is really lagging behind in terms of viral meningitis, so why people get ill, and more importantly, why they continue to experience after effects for many months following their illness. We want to invest into viral meningitis and bacterial meningitis so that we can improve rehabilitation and outcomes, so that when people do experience disease, they can make a recovery as quickly as possible and in the best possible way. It will take time, it will not be done in the next few years, but Meningitis Now will continue to be there for those people.
When you think 30 years on, how many vaccines we've achieved, and we've had the HIV vaccine, so now nearly almost all under 5 babies are protected against HIV. I think that vaccine was 98% effective within like 2 years. And then meningococcal C and now meningococcal B, and obviously we've got lots of other vaccines that were there but are now being improved. So it's pretty amazing because it's been a notifiable disease since 1912. I just think ordinary people can do amazing things if they put mind to it.
body is tired and racked with meningitis B, and it was ultimately consumed by it. Faye Burdett's death has since prompted more than 500,000 people to sign a petition pleading for all children to be immunised against it. Harmony Rose also had the disease 18 months ago, but she survived. Yet she struggles every single day of her young life. All her limbs had to be amputated because of it.
One day she turned around and said, "Mummy, where's Harmony's hands?" And I said, "Oh, you don't need hands anyway." And she turned around and said, "Oh, meningitis doesn't care who it gets and what they look like or who they are, how rich they are. It can get anybody."
A year-old child is not at the moment eligible for a B vaccine. There are so many different ways and means of finding out about the seriousness of meningitis, and at the moment the instinct has been about rash, also been mentioned about ibuprofen and Calpol. That seems to be a default system around this type of disease. I know, and my wife knows, we're very, very lucky that we're in a position we can still talk about Sammy, but that's not always the case, and it's a matter of minutes and hours that makes a difference.
Now, there's increasing pressure on the government today after a petition calling for the meningitis B vaccination to be offered to all children has become the most signed online petition in parliamentary history, attracting over 680,000 signatures to date.
Well, the petition comes after 2-year-old Faye Burdett lost her brave battle to meningitis on Valentine's Day, bringing the terrifying disease into the headlines once again.
Well, one father who is firmly backing this campaign is former England rugby player Matt Dawson, whose 2-year-old son Sammy was left fighting for his life after he contracted meningitis just 3 weeks ago. So this is very, very recent for you. Thank you for. How is he today?
He's doing remarkably well. He's not walking, being in bed, and because of the cannula and maybe some bits and pieces, his legs aren't working quite as well as we would like. But in himself, he's
on the mend. I mean, this is something that, as a parent, it's terrifying. It's the thing that you're most scared of happening. You hope that you notice the signs when they come along. What happened to Sammy? Because it was just after his 2nd birthday, wasn't it?
I wish that I had your concern previous to it, because I have to put my hands up. I was a little bit ignorant to it all. I didn't realise really how dangerous meningitis could be, and I think that's part of the problem.
These are the harrowing pictures that persuaded MPs to listen. But it was the death of 2-year-old Faye Burdett that first prompted a campaign now backed by almost 1 million parents. Today, hers told their story for the first time.
She was looked at the clinic. We were there for probably 2 hours and discharged with a viral infection. So, I mean, 6 hours later we were back there and she was critically ill.
Like Faye, at just 7 months, Amelia was too old to be vaccinated on the NHS, missing the cut-off by a matter of weeks. The disease killed her in a matter of hours.
She'd literally doubled inside from where they'd put so many fluids and different things in her to try and keep her alive. It didn't even look like my little girl.
They too want the vaccine they believe could have saved Amelia extended to every child under 11.
It gives them a 90% chance, which is 90% more chance than what she had.
The government's scientific advisors say that wouldn't be a cost-effective use of the NHS's limited resources. But Faye's parents argue that doesn't take into account how much care is needed for children who survive with chronic disabilities.
If you vaccinate and stop that happening, across the board you're saving millions of pounds, and families like ours having to go through life-changing experiences.
No one would want to deny children like this. The evidence on exactly what we can afford will be delivered next week.
Not only is my constituents Neil and Jennifer are the parents of Faye who died. It's a really awful disease, and they've asked me to be a voice for their concerns and wanting to prevent other children suffering. So I want to push the government to look at this again. That's why I raised it with the Prime Minister.
But they've looked at this. They've followed the advice of the Joint Committee on Vaccination and Immunisation. They followed that advice, and the advice was, we can't extend this. It's not cost effective. So presumably they've got very little room for manoeuvre.